So when a team or an organization has it, there is one quality that we discovered that most probably wouldn't catch.
Right.
Vision's obvious, focus is obvious, camaraderie, that might not be as obvious, but you tend to see it. Innovation, yeah, we admire those who innovate. Yeah. The next quality we found was not as obvious at first, but once we saw it, you couldn't miss it. Mm-hmm. And that is, whenever a team has it, they have a willingness to fail or a willingness to fall short.
Right, for sure.
Talk to me a little bit about when we first discovered that. How'd you see it?
Oh, I remember back when one of our first things that we saw was when we believed in video teaching. We're like, oh, this is going to be great. Let's create a video venue.
Yes.
Where people can come and they just want to watch the message on video. And it did so good that it lasted like 3 months or so, 4 months.
If that much, yes.
And we had to kill it.
Yeah, kill it. And so just to be clear, we were amongst the first churches to do video teaching, and in many ways have been known as one of them that does it well. And the very first video worship experience that we created failed miserably.
Miserably. But yet we're known for video teaching today.
Right.
That doesn't make any sense
doesn't make
unless
any sense,
there's a culture
that's willing to fail.
That's willing to fail.
We also have churches in different states, 13 states now. The first time we went out of state,
did not work.
It's not still there.
It's not still there.
It's not still there,
it's
right?
It's not there any longer.
It failed.
It's correct.
Embarrassing.
Yep.
Miserable. Wish it hadn't happened. Common denominator from both those experiences, what happened on the backside?
We grew.
We grew.
We grew.
We learned.
Yep. And I love how you've taught us and created a culture where, you know what, failure, we say it's not an option, but it's actually applauded when you fail correctly. Because there's actually a way to fail incorrectly, and we call that like a disqualifying versus a qualifying failure. And just to set the groundwork, and then I want you to talk to this, is like, obviously disqualifying failures would be, man, you've done something really wrong, like a moral
don't do that.
problem. That's not a good thing. The other thing that would be disqualifying is continued repetitive same failures.
Stupid to say, yes.
And over and over on the same subject. So when you qualify, all of a sudden is when you start to learn.
Yes.
You've created a great culture to give us the freedom to do that.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about that.
Or it could be that you failed and you don't learn from it, meaning it's the first time you failed and you just failed and you keep on going. So what you want to do, both with your failures and with your successes, is you want to know why. What went right, what went wrong. In the same way, you want to kind of dissect in your failures. You also don't want to do it with your successes. I think it was Andy Stanley said, if you don't know why something is working when it is, you won't know how to fix it when it's not. So we want to know why something's working and when it didn't work. In fact, the things that we are probably best at today were all born out of failures in the past.
Correct.
Video teaching failed. Campus out of state failed. Our first attempt to do something with the Bible, YouVersion.com, failed, and now YouVersion is on over 500 million devices. So the most important and effective things we're doing were all born out of failures. You have to recognize that. To quote, who was it? Churchill, somebody said, failure is not final.
Right.
Failure is an event, never a person.
Yep.
We have to internalize these things. A failure is an event, it's not a person. Correct. Failure isn't final. And what we want to do is we want to create a culture where people just are simply not afraid to fail. We were together with an organization that we loved that took a lot of risk, failed, took risk, got really, really big. And they said to us, when you get to be our size, you can't afford to fail. And that's when they stopped growing. When you don't have a willingness to fail, you don't have the possibility to grow. I want to say that again. If you don't have the willingness to fail, you don't have the possibility to grow because you have to try new things, do things better, and there has to be some risk along the way. And I'm thankful that sometimes we celebrate failures. We make fun of them.
For sure. I think one of the things I appreciate about you the most, you read all the time and you always are ideating. You come up with all these crazy ideas. Yesterday you came in, you grabbed Jerry and I, you're like, listen, sit down, fellas. I got to talk about something. I got this idea. Probably not going to work. It's probably stupid, but let me throw it at you. With obviously the willingness to be like, man, this might not work. And it might be bad. You talked about the organization that had grown so much that they had all of a sudden said, we can't, we shouldn't fail. But you've always been in a posture of learning. Because you learn, you try new things. Because you try new things, some of them work amazingly, some of them don't. So talk to those leaders who start to get into that position where they feel like there's too much at stake, there's too much at risk to really step out and try this, to do this? Just how do you personally keep yourself at a point where you're willing to walk in our office and be like, I know it's gotten crazy and I know, but let me just toss out a big one for you.
Sure. So I would say first, just to be really clear, there are some risks that just aren't wise to take. Meaning, there's some people may have some kind of idea and it's just not a good idea. So what I'm not talking about is foolish risk taking. I'm talking about strategic, prayerful risk taking. And I'll just be like really honest. I've always been afraid of failing. I think I quit baseball because if you're good at baseball, you get on base 1 out of 3 times. And I hated failing 2 out of 3 times. Like literally, I think that's what drove me out of the sport because I hated to fail. And so to this day, even though I've failed a lot, I still hate to fail. You will always feel a little bit of fear. And we just say, feel the fear and lead anyway. Meaning don't try to get it to go away. And what is the antidote to the fear of failure? It's not success.
Right.
The antidote to the fear of failure, I think it was Batterson who said this, is a little bit of failure. Meaning when you do fail in some small ways or even in some big ways, as long as it's not a catastrophic moral or kind of, too risky of a ministry-ending failure, you learn from it and you get better. And I would just say to a leader, if you haven't failed in the last year or so somewhere, you're probably playing it too safe.
Yep.
You're probably playing it too safe. We have to take some risks. And even I had an assistant one time that just was playing it so safe. Her assignment I gave her, I want to see 3 aggressive failures in the next quarter. So before we meet again, what I'm going to do, we're going to celebrate you doing too much rather than too little. And some team members, you almost have to push them to do that. So if you do fail, you recognize it's not the end of the world.
Absolutely. And I think that you really hit a good key of, when you start playing it safe is when you stop actually, failing and doing things. And I think it is critical for us as leaders to be at a point where we are willing to fail and celebrating the right types of failure in our team and giving that permission, I think is so critical to move the mission forward. And again, we saw it on teams. We saw it on teams that were willing to do that. And I think it's key that you gave permission for that assistant to be able to maybe do a little bit too much and then talk about it. So talk about a little bit of when people fail, how do you as a leader learn from the failure? And then how can you appropriately, even in a culture like celebrate the failure appropriately so that others can look on and be like, oh, I could do this too.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a great question. We had one of our campus pastors make a pretty significant mistake. And so there's a time to correct in private and there's a time to correct in public. And on this particular instance, we chose to take it public because 1, we wanted to help set an example that this is inappropriate. 2 is we wanted to publicly forgive because everybody knew that there had been an offense.
Right.
And if we had just handled it in private, we wouldn't have given them the gift of public forgiveness. And so we took it public and said this was wrong and we've corrected it, we've handled it privately and there's nobody's going to talk about it before we're going to move forward. And so what that did is that gave people the idea that we can actually afford to fail. And again, keeping it current, going back to yesterday, we did a lot together yesterday, right?
We did
a busy day, but I did bring an idea in and we looked at it together and we recognized, I'm talking, how long did we talk about it?
10, 15 minutes. Yeah.
How big of a decision is it?
It's huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
And how quickly did we get excited and say, let's try a version of it?
10, 15 minutes.
10 or 15 minutes in an unplanned meeting, massive, and with the real risk of failing and without having any kind of formal discussion, without even looping in one person that I had to call later on the night to loop in.
Right.
We said, hey, let's give this thing a roll. And so that's what I want to do is encourage people that in order to continue growing, you have to be willing to fail. And some of the best things you're going to do are born out of failure. And so if you haven't failed in a while, let me just say lovingly, you're probably playing it too safe. And so I would ask you the question, what is the next faith risk that it's time for you to take?